Have you ever had to stand absolutely still before? I mean, not moving a single muscle for fear that it might cost you your life. Standing there looking over at Brian, his arms and legs are locked in place, and I can see sweat dripping from his forehead onto his clothing. The fear in his eyes mimic mine perfectly. The scent of blood has been permeating the air with each passing second. Shifting my eyes downward, I could see Alice, her tearful yet lifeless eyes staring back at me. Her arm is outstretched towards my leg, though it has been some time since it last moved. Looking beyond Brian, I can see the outline of Billy's body in the darkness near the trees. He tried to make a run for it, and only made it a handful of steps. Natalie is sitting near one of the tents. Her cheeks are stained with tears, though she has been doing well to stifle her sobs. She keeps looking at me and Brian for help, but we are unable to offer her any. I can feel warm breath coating the back of my neck. The scent is horrid, like week old garbage that had been left to rot in a storm drain. The smoke from the campfire isn't helping much either, just mixing with the scent of blood and breath, swirling together into a foul putridness. I can feel its presence standing mere inches behind me. Despite its appearance, the subtlety in which it moves is startling. You would have no idea it was creeping up behind you, until it was too late. Although the present danger is consuming most of my thought process at the moment, I can't help but think back to when this all started. 3 days ago, I was sitting in my living room relaxing after a taxing day at work, my rumbling stomach begging me to order food. As I was browsing through the multiple food listing apps, my phone suddenly began to buzz. The alert startled me for a moment until I realized who was calling me. It was the only person who ever calls me, and it's probably the only person on Earth who calls anyone anymore. It was Billy, and the moment I pressed the accept call button on my phone, which in hindsight I shouldn't have, Billy exploded through my speaker.
"T, what's up, man? What you got going on?"
he shouted. I rubbed my eyes and held the phone a few inches away from my ear. Not much, Billy. What are you doing?
"Man, just getting some people together to hang out at the lake."
Oh, that sounds fun. Well, hope you have a good time.
"Come on, T, don't be like that. I need you to come out here with us. It'll be fun."
This didn't sound super appealing to me to begin with, so I just tried to brush him off. However, Billy was quite persistent. After nearly 20 minutes of badgering and discussing the terms of the trip, I could quite literally feel myself cave in like a crumpled tin can. He explained that it was only going to be a handful of people going to the lake this upcoming weekend. He said he desperately needed a break from the monotony of everyday life. He also reminded me a few times that he showed up as a wingman for me on more than one occasion. After being verbally beaten down and guilt-tripped into a corner, I agreed. The weekend arrived, and before I knew it, I was standing outside on my front porch with a backpack in hand. Billy's loud Jeep rattled up my driveway, and in a grand gesture, he stood up and asked what I was waiting for. Billy is a lot to handle at times, but he means well and for the most part is a generally good guy. He just likes to take things up a notch. I tossed my bag in the back and crawled into the back seat next to the girls. I knew Alice from high school, though I'm sure during those days she probably didn't realize I even existed. This was my first time meeting Natalie, on the other hand. We all shared introductions, and I tried my best not to crowd them, despite the narrow seating arrangement. Brian was another guy whom I knew from high school, but he didn't stand out much. He was a large, quiet, and soft-spoken guy if memory served, as we hadn't really interacted much. Honestly, it was quite surprising to see him in the passenger seat next to Billy, who was so loud and boisterous. We spent the next several hours listening to Billy rattle off stories from his past. Alice and Brian just spent a good portion of it on their phones. Meanwhile, Natalie and I just stared out of the windows, basically drifting off into our own little worlds. It wasn't long until we were turning off the main stretch of road and onto the rocky path through the trees. The path, despite its roughness, was surprisingly straight. It continued inward for a few miles until it spilled out into a parking area. We parked the Jeep and disembarked. Billy tossed me one of the tents while he and Brian carried the other things. A weathered wooden sign near a footpath signified a camping area ahead. Billy gestured for us to follow him as he marched onward. The camping area wasn't exactly what I had expected. I thought it would be this great large clearing that multiple people could use simultaneously, but the area was barely large enough for just us. I passively brought it up to Billy, who just said that there were other camping sites dotted throughout the area like this. The girls helped set up camp while Billy and I scavenged firewood from nearby. I jokingly asked him where the lake was, and Billy just pointed off in a random direction. He said that the lake was a bit further inward, but that it was difficult to camp there due to the lack of space from the trees to the water. As we were picking up the various twigs and branches, I thought I heard something shuffling in the brush nearby. I looked over in the direction of the noise, but I saw nothing but plants. Billy tossed a twig at me and told me to quit daydreaming. We started the fire, and just before sun began to set, we pulled out some foldable chairs while Billy handed out beer and snacks. Truth be told, this was actually really nice. I was having a surprisingly good time. We were all laughing together and sharing jokes. Billy was reiterating stories from the car ride up here, but we didn't mind. Even Brian chimed in with a story or two. While we all enjoyed each other's company, I absent-mindedly gazed around the campsite. The flickering light from the fire bounced off the tree trunks and branches, casting long, jagged shadows all around us. My eyes drifted from shadow to tree, and then my eyes stopped. There was a face, peeking out from between two trees. The light ebbed and flowed, causing the face to appear and disappear at regular intervals. It was difficult to see what it was, but it clearly wasn't a part of nature. Plus, it seemed to be hovering in the darkness. I told everyone to quiet down, and they all turned to me with confused expressions. I calmly asked what that was as I pointed in the direction of the trees. All in unison, everyone turned their attention onto the dark wall of trees. There was a collection of audible gasps, and both Billy and Brian stood from their seats. This caused Alice and I to stand as well. Natalie remained seated near one of the tents but kept her eyes trained on the face in the distance. We all watched as this thing began to move out of the trees, closer into the light. Its body was jet black, like it had pulled the darkness from the woods and wore it like a skin. Its neck and limbs extended far beyond that of a normal person. Its torso was relatively small in comparison to its appendages. Despite its blackened appearance, I could see the outline of its ribcage. It looked extremely emaciated, like it hadn't eaten in years. It took one exaggerated step after another, and when each foot struck the ground, I heard nothing but silence. It held out two spindly arms in front of its body, almost like a T-Rex. It would have been somewhat funny if I wasn't so terrified. Its fingers were thin like needles, and they stretched nearly a foot from the hand itself. Alice shrieked and spun to run away. In a flash, I watched the creature snap its attention onto her and close the distance to her in milliseconds. She held up an arm to shield herself from its advance, and with one swift motion, it brought its sharp fingers down, severing her arm in two. She cried out once more, and the creature punctured her chest with all 5 needle-like fingers. She collapsed onto the ground, reaching out for me. Billy shouted and began running away from the camp towards the woods. Brian, who was right next to me, was about to turn and follow suit, but something forced me to reach out and grab him by the arm. The creature twisted its face towards Billy, and in the blink of an eye, all we heard was Billy's body impact the dirt. Natalie was frozen in place. Her eyes glanced up at me and I just mouthed, "Shh," back to her. I could tell she was biting her lips to keep her from weeping. Feeling the breath pass over the nape of my neck, I shut my eyes hoping this nightmare would end. Then, I heard the sound of dirt and gravel being disturbed. I cracked open an eye and saw the lifeless face of Alice being dragged away from the fire into the woods. After a few moments, both Alice and the creature disappeared into the trees. I turned to Brian and Natalie. I whispered for them not to move a muscle. I then turned and crept my way over to Billy, as slow as humanly possible. It took me nearly 10 minutes to make it over to him, and he wasn't even that far away. Standing over him, I felt sick. His head was missing. I felt tears trying to force their way out of my eyes. I slowly reached down and fished his car keys from his pocket. As I stood back up and turned back to Brian and Natalie, I was face to face with the creature. I wanted to scream harder than I ever had before, but I just froze, biting down on the inside of my cheek so I wouldn't scream. I could taste the metallic liquid pooling in the back of my mouth. The creature was looking at me with hollow eyes, and for a few seconds I thought I'd share Billy's fate. Then, a moment later, it reached down, grabbed Billy's leg, and began dragging him off into the woods. I waited for a few seconds for the rustling of leaves to grow faint before slowly making my way back to the camp. I motioned for Brian and Natalie to follow me, and one by one, we crept back down the path, leaving everything behind. We found Billy's Jeep, and as soon as I started the engine, I vomited outside of the window. Natalie broke down in tears, and Brian was as pale as a ghost. We drove out of there and back onto the main road. I parked on the side of the road and asked Natalie if I could borrow her phone, as I had left mine in the tent. She handed it to me and I shakily called the police. I told them that a wild animal had attacked our camp and had dragged our friends into the woods. We sat in the car for 45 minutes before the sheriffs arrived. I felt absolutely disgusted lying about what we had witnessed, but it's not like I could have said, "Yes, a giant monster with needle fingers murdered our friends and dragged them into the woods." I explained to the sheriff that it was dark and we think it was a bear or a cougar. After standing on the road for nearly 5 hours, the sun began to rise. The sheriff scoured our campsite and found nothing but 2 pools of blood. They even followed the blood into the woods, but couldn't discern the location of our friends. We contacted their family shortly after that. They were devastated. I held Billy's mother's hand for hours. I don't think she'll ever be the same after this. I don't think any of us will ever be the same after this. I've been trying my best to get through this traumatic event, but yesterday, as I was sitting in my living room flipping through the TV, I came across a news report. They were talking about a campsite up near the lake, saying that a string of campers have started to go missing lately, and that they'll be shutting the area down until further notice. I'm no stranger to the scent of industrial cleaners or the sounds of monitors beeping in the distance. Hospitals had started to feel like a second home to me. I've been coming here regularly throughout my adult life. However, recently it seems like it's every single day. My wife, Hannah, has been in and out of the hospital nearly her entire life. She was born with a weak constitution and has always been prone to illnesses. However, just by looking at her, you wouldn't think her weak at all. She's one of those people who have larger-than-life personalities, always full of laughter and compassion whenever in the presence of others. However, the same can't be said from behind closed doors. When it was just me and her, she'd be so drained of energy it would leave her bedridden for days at a time. This often led to her catching some type of virus or infection that would send her right back to the hospital. As much as I hate to admit it, this has become the norm for us. When we first started dating, it only happened every so often, but as the years passed by, the illnesses seemed to pile on. Some people might think a relationship such as this one would be a burden, and while I do admit things have been challenging at times, I would never trade her for anything. I actually owe my life to Hannah. She saved me when I was at my lowest, and I have been grateful to her ever since. We started dating shortly after that, and we never looked back. During the winter, Hannah had gotten a bad case of pneumonia, and it hit her hard. That set off a series of illnesses that compiled until she was forced to remain in the hospital indefinitely. I hated seeing her like this. I felt so powerless to do anything to help her recover. Nearly halfway through the 3rd month, the doctor approached me and informed me that her condition was rapidly deteriorating. They said that she wasn't responding well to any of the treatments and they were running out of options. I was furious when I heard this. I found myself shouting at the doctor, asking him what the hell I was even paying him for. He just lowered his head curtly, before emotionlessly apologizing, something doctors seem to be exceptionally good at. I could feel my anger and frustration rising within me. I was about to give the doctor a bit more than just a piece of my mind, when I felt something grab my arm. I looked down and saw Hannah smiling at me from her bed. Instantly, the anger, hatred, and frustration all vanished. I felt the weight of the entire world fall off of me. The doctor took his leave, and we just sat together for hours. Hannah assured me that none of this in any way was my fault, and that regardless of what happens, that she would always be with me. I hated hearing her say that. Talking like she was ready to give up, and throwing everything to the wind. I told her that I needed her to focus on recovering, so we could continue being happy together. She just returned a faint smile, brushed the side of my face, and said okay. I knew she was just telling me what I wanted to hear, but it didn't matter. I still enjoyed hearing it. I told her I was going to step outside and grab something to drink from the vending machine. I asked if she wanted anything, and she just brushed a hand. As soon as her hospital room door shut behind me, I felt like something was off. The hallway was somewhat darkened, and I could no longer hear the shuffling footsteps or the rhythmic beeps of monitors in the distance. I couldn't even see any doctors, nurses, or patients walking around. I thought it was odd, but it was growing late into the evening. I had been staying here later and later, trying to spend as much time with Hannah as possible. I just thought that maybe it was a slow night for the hospital. Then I pondered if hospitals even have slow nights. I marched up to the vending machine and retrieved my wallet. I stood there carefully examining all my options, when suddenly I heard a voice from behind me say, "What'll it be?" I nearly jumped out of my skin and spun around. Standing behind me was an older-looking man. He was sporting a decent-looking suit and a hat, and brandishing a cane, though it didn't seem like he needed one. He greeted me with a large, toothy smile, and I just nervously nodded back to him. I turned back around, trying to steady my rapidly thudding heart. I quickly decided on an item and stepped aside for the old man to use the machine. He just stood there, smiling at me. I asked him if he was going to use it, but his gaze never drifted off of me. A moment later, he began to speak. "You're here for your wife, aren't you?" I was stunned when I heard this. "Yeah. How did you?" The man raised a hand to me. "It's written all over your face. It was either your partner or child, and I just guessed." I chuckled quietly to myself and nodded. He then said something cryptic to me, something which at the time I thought little of. "What would you give to fix her condition?" "Anything," I responded. I didn't even hesitate. "Anything? Really? I might be able to provide some assistance then. I know some, powerful people who might be able to do something about your wife's situation." At the time, I thought he was referring to like the chief of medicine or something like that. I quickly asked him if he could help. He nodded before continuing. "Things like this usually have a price." "Name it," I replied without missing a beat. The old man thought for a few minutes, then a few minutes more. He turned to me and told me to think of a number between 1 and 10. Strange question, but I just glanced around for a moment before deciding upon a number. He then held out a hand to me and asked me very directly, "Would you like me to save your wife?" "Yes," I said, gripping his hand tightly and shaking it. "Very well," he answered. He retrieved his hand from my grip, slightly bowed towards me, and walked off down the hallway. The entire interaction was an odd one, but as soon as I entered the hospital room, all of my thoughts vanished when I saw Hannah sleeping there. I brushed the hair from her face and hoped she would be all right. During the 4th month, Hannah's condition began to change. Her vitals and demeanor were improving dramatically. The doctors couldn't explain it, and neither could Hannah. She just continually expressed how she never felt this good before. We went home about halfway through the 4th month in the hospital. Since then, the years began to fly by, and it was like Hannah had become a completely new person. She was still herself, of course, but so much brighter. We traveled the world together, doing all the things we never could before. She still couldn't explain how this happened, and whenever she questioned it, I'd just shrug. However, I'd think about that old man I spoke to in the hallway, and how he must have spoken to the head doctor and got her on some new medication. Things in our life had never been better, until 6 years since that hospital night passed. I suddenly started to have terrible nightmares. At first, I wasn't sure what was happening. Hannah would wake me up in the middle of the night to tell me I was shouting and struggling in my sleep. Oddly though, I had no memory of such a nightmare. As the weeks passed, I began waking myself up in a cold sweat, but still having no memory of what caused it. This continued for weeks, and while Hannah was growing worried for me, I just chalked it up to work-related stress. Then, after around 6 months, I began to notice something strange. Whenever I would drive home from work at night, I thought I could see people standing outside in the dark. At first, I thought it was my eyes just playing tricks on me, but the more it started to happen, the more I realized that wasn't the case. I decided not to tell Hannah about this, as I didn't want her to worry. I honestly thought that I had become so overworked that I was starting to hallucinate. I tried to ignore it and hoped that it would just go away. During that time, Hannah could tell something was wrong. She was always asking me if I was okay, to which I'd smile and tell her I was fine. About a week ago, I was startled awake once again by some unknown nightmare. I sat up in my bed and looked to Hannah, who was still asleep next to me. I smiled at her, got up and grabbed a glass of water. As I sipped from the glass, I walked over to our living room window and glanced outside of it. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. There were hundreds of silhouettes, all standing outside of our house, and more were appearing by the minute. Hannah came rushing out asking if I was all right. I snapped from the window and looked down. I apologized to her and told her that my hand must have slipped. She grabbed some paper towels and walked over to me. She looked out of the window and asked what I was staring at. I told her nothing. But that was a lie. Those faceless people were all standing there, outside of our house. Last night, as I was taking some much-needed time off from work, Hannah was cleaning up the house. I sat there on the couch in a daze when I heard Hannah say something from the kitchen. She said, "Wow, 7 years already." I glanced over and asked her what she was talking about. She said that it's almost been 7 years since that night in the hospital. When I heard this, my body tensed up. She noticed my uncomfortable expression and asked what was wrong. I just shook my head and told her it was nothing. That night, as Hannah drifted off to sleep, I sat down at my desk and began to write this out. The reason that I wanted to get this all down was because of what Hannah had said earlier. She said it had been 7 years since that night. Despite all the time that has passed since then, I still remember that night very clearly. I remember the old man and the conversation we had together. I even remember the number that the man asked me to choose. The number between 1 and 10. It was 7. 7 years. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. All these troubling experiences I've been having lately all seem to be culminating into one point. I just wanted to say that I do not regret whatever happens. I'm glad for the time I got to spend with my wife, and I'm glad that she's still here with me. I just wish I would have chosen the number 10 instead of 7. Hannah, if you wake up and I'm not here, just know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not telling you, and I love you very much. I'm not sure, but I think I just heard a faint knock behind me, coming from the door. The bedroom door. My name is Connor, and I suffer from an affliction known as sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis episodes are actually fairly common among a lot of adults, and are generally of little concern as far as a medical condition. There are no known methods of treatment, and most people usually only have 1 or 2 episodes a year, if that. I, on the other hand, am not so lucky. I am one of the 5% of sleep paralysis sufferers that experiences an episode multiple times a week. In case you are fortunate enough never to have experienced sleep paralysis yourself, I'll try to explain it to the best of my ability. Unfortunately, when explained to someone who has never experienced an episode themselves, the symptoms can sometimes sound like downright hysteria. But I digress. Sleep paralysis is a state, during wake up or falling asleep, in which a person is mentally aware, but physically unable to move or speak. During an episode, you might typically hallucinate and hear, feel, or see things that are not there. Depending on the hallucination, this can be one of the most terrifying experiences of your life. Episodes generally last less than a couple of minutes in reality, but to the afflicted, it can feel like hours. Sleep paralysis isn't a new phenomenon either. In fact, sleep paralysis has been described throughout history for thousands of years. One of the most common hallucinations, the night hag, is a generic name for a folkloric creature found in cultures around the world. and is commonly used to explain the phenomenon of sleep paralysis. The general description is that a person feels the presence of a supernatural malevolent immobilizing them, as if sitting on their chest. Some scientists have suggested sleep paralysis as an explanation for reports of paranormal phenomena, such as ghost encounters, alien abductions, demons or demonic possession, the infamous night hag sightings, and shadow people hauntings as well. If nothing else, my personal hallucinations always vary from episode to episode, so it's never a boring experience. Some people are plagued by the same visions night after night, but I guess as revenge for trying to outsmart it, my brain likes to keep the horrors fresh and diverse to keep me on my toes. The episode started when I was about 12 years old. I was a foster kid being bounced around from group home to group home. Because of the rocky start I had in life, I had a lot of behavioral problems and found myself getting kicked out of every new house shortly after my arrival. Things were turbulent for me, and I was frequently under a lot of stress and anxiety because of the situation I was in. I didn't sleep much at all when I would arrive in the new homes, and it was one night shortly after arriving in the worst group home of all that I would have my very first episode of sleep paralysis. I had been shown my room earlier that day by the woman who ran the group home. I was sleeping in the bottom bunk in a 2-bunk bed bedroom, along with 2 other boys my age. Fortunately for me, the kid who was supposed to use the bunk above mine hadn't arrived just yet, so I didn't have to worry about him snoring or keeping me up that night. I was already on edge being in a new environment, and I was extra anxious due to a brief altercation I had earlier in the day with my caseworker. I tossed and turned for a while until eventually I heard the soft snoring from the other 2 boys, coming from the bunk bed parallel to mine. They had been chatting with each other for what felt like an eternity, so I was grateful when they finally passed out, and I could enjoy the peace and some semblance of quiet. I rolled over onto my back and closed my eyes. Even then, I liked to sleep on my back because it felt like no one could sneak up on me, or get the jump on me in any way. I felt myself dozing off, when suddenly, the sound of a thud happened on the bunk directly above me, followed by the sound of squeaking springs, as if someone was shifting their weight across the mattress. My eyes shot open, staring straight ahead at the bunk above. My mind raced as I second-guessed myself. Didn't the woman I spoke with earlier tell me that no one was going to be using that bunk for a while? Surely I would have noticed someone climbing up there, I thought to myself. Slowly but surely, I heard the sound of springs inside the mattress above me creaking, moving closer to the edge of the bed. Whoever was up there was either trying to come down or was about to lean over the edge to strike up a conversation. I wasn't particularly interested in either. That's when I saw the long, spindly fingers slither down from over the edge of the top bunk and curl themselves into the wood above me. Pulling down after them was a wide, gray, hideous face with black beady eyes and a disturbingly wide ear-to-ear grin. I could feel sweat beading on my face, and I tensed my body to roll off the bed and run. That's when I came to the horrifying realization that I could neither move my arms nor my legs. I could only stare in abject terror at the horrifying monstrosity above me. I opened my mouth to scream for the other boys in the room, unleashing every ounce of sound I could muster from my adolescent lungs. I screamed and screamed as the creature and its hideous grin descended down towards me. But nobody came to save me. Eventually, I blacked out, I assume from the terror of what was happening. I awoke the next morning safely in my bed, lying on my back, exactly as I had fallen asleep. Remembering the night before, I quickly sat up and looked over to the boys lying in the bunk across from mine, making sure they hadn't been massacred by whatever demon creature had been in here with us the night before. Both of them were awake and unharmed, hanging out on their beds and talking to one another about their plans for the day. Shaken, I asked them how they didn't hear me screaming for them the night before. One of them shrugged, and the other shook his head and confirmed that I hadn't made a sound all night. One of the boys even said he had gotten up shortly after falling asleep to use the bathroom, and I was dead asleep the entire time. These episodes would continue, but it wasn't until I was an adult living in my own apartment that I would finally have a medical professional explain sleep paralysis to me. Until then, I simply thought that maybe my hallucinations were some kind of paranormal psychic connection to the supernatural, or possibly the symptom of an underlying repressed trauma that I needed to work out. Either way, finding out that there was a name for what I was experiencing was a huge weight off my shoulders, and allowed me to deal with each episode a little better every time they would come along. I can now generally identify when an episode is beginning, and better prepare myself mentally for whatever hallucination I might be forced to deal with. Recently, I moved into a small house with my wife in a quiet little suburb closer to my office. My wife and I were both children of the foster system, so we can be a little overprotective when it comes to our security. Shortly after moving in, we installed security cameras in both the master bedroom and the living room to give us some peace of mind when we get called away for business. On one particular occasion, my wife had been called out of town for a conference over the weekend, leaving me to fend for myself at home. The week I had at work was incredibly stressful, so after coming home on a Friday evening, I took a quick shower and hopped straight into bed. Maybe minutes after drifting off, I began to feel that eerie sensation creeping down my spine. I had experienced it enough to recognize the phantom feeling of being watched. I heaved a deep sigh and prepared myself for whatever hallucination this episode might bring me. On nights like that one where I'm particularly exhausted, I tend to keep my eyes shut during the event and just ride out the horrific auditory hallucinations that might come my way. Sometimes it's the sound of screaming. Sometimes it's growling noises from some unseen monster in the darkness. That night, it was only footsteps, then some rummaging, then the sound of the bedroom door latch clicking shut. It wasn't unusual for an episode to involve some kind of intruder who would let themselves in, poke around a bit, and then leave. Not only did I not pay it a second thought, I never even opened my eyes before drifting right back off to sleep. The weekend passed without me ever thinking about the episode a few nights before, and Sunday evening arrived before I knew it. My wife arrived home and I greeted her before heading off to the office to get an early start on some spreadsheets that my boss would be expecting on his desk the next morning. When I arrived home, my wife called me into the other room and told me to look at her laptop right away. My stomach sank as I saw the color drain from my wife's face, as she asked me if I had checked the security tape from the night she had been gone. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened, so I told her that I hadn't had a reason to. She wordlessly turned the laptop to face me, and I watched a time lapse of that Friday evening begin to play back. Around 15 minutes after I arrived home, shortly after I had gotten into the shower, the figure of a man wearing a ski mask and all black clothing opened the door to the bedroom and began to look around the room for valuables. He seems to hear the shower turning off and shuffles over to the open closet on the other side of the room. I lie down to go to sleep, and shortly after, the masked man quietly re-enters from the closet, checking the dressers for valuables before leaving and shutting the door behind him. We immediately called the police and searched around the house for anything that might have been taken. A few forgettable odds and ends appeared to be missing, but otherwise nothing else worth mentioning. After reviewing the same footage from the perspective of the living room camera, it's clear to see that in my stressed out haze, I had forgotten to arm the alarm system behind me after coming home from work. The intruder came in through the garage door, which we usually leave unlocked out of habit. I consider myself lucky that I wasn't seriously hurt or even killed, but one thing is for certain. I will never be able to dismiss an episode of sleep paralysis ever again. My wife Leah has the most beautiful blue eyes that I have ever seen. From the very first moment that we met, those ice blue marbles of hers knocked me off my feet. She always gets compliments about them whenever the two of us go out, and she never lacks for comments whenever she posts a photo on Instagram. I bring this up because something truly bizarre began to happen shortly after we moved into our new home. A few months ago, we purchased a quaint little Victorian fixer-upper on a small piece of property out in the countryside. Nothing extravagant, just a couple of acres for the two of us to get some fresh air. The majority of the property was comprised of a long, winding driveway in the front of the house, so the acreage didn't really account for a whole lot. I'm a fairly established editorial writer for an online media website, so my work can easily be done anywhere where we can get electricity and a stable Wi-Fi connection. And my wife is the social media manager of a fairly prominent construction company, so her work is entirely remote as well. We had decided that since we are both in our 30s with no kids and no offices to tie us to the big city, now would be the opportune time to find somewhere where we could get away from the bustle of society and enjoy each other's company. A friend of a friend introduced us to the real estate agent that had recently sold their parents a vacation home, and before we knew it, the agent had sent us a listing that he thought would be exactly what we were looking for. A few days later, we were driving up the winding driveway to what would soon be our first real home together. The transition from cramped little city apartments with sirens and artificial lights to the warm glow of a sunset viewed from the comfort of a rocking chair on your back patio is truly mind-blowing. Sure, the house was a little on the older side and would need a touch of fixing up, but from the moment we walked in the front door, we both knew this was where we wanted to live. It wasn't long before we had finished moving in, and the last of the boxes had finally been unpacked. One of my favorite features of the house was the expansive entryway that you'd be greeted with upon entering the front door, which included a remarkable stained glass window above the door and a decorative ornate mirror directly off to the side as soon as you walked in. The mirror had been tightly affixed to the wall itself, so I just assumed that it had been too much of a hassle for the previous owners to remove and take with them. One of the final touches Leah and I had put into furnishing our new home was to place a rustic-looking wooden credenza right beneath the mirror, as a place for us to set our keys, wallets, and anything else we might need before heading out of the door. It felt almost ceremonious for us to retrieve our keys from the bowl on the credenza every time we got ready to leave. I may sound a bit theatrical, but the house almost made me feel a bit like royalty. After only a week, Leah had gotten into the habit of primping in front of the large mirror before we'd go out and do anything. I'd patiently wait on the couch in the next room and admire her as she fixed her hair and inspected her reflection. That's when I started to notice something strange. One day while I was waiting for her to finish getting ready to go out, I was sitting on the couch with my phone. I was scrolling through the numerous emails I had received from work because my coworkers were all incompetent apparently. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Aaliyah walk up to the mirror to do her customary final checks. I looked up, asking if she was nearly ready, and she turned, rolling those stunning blue eyes at me, before giving me an annoyed smirk. I returned an amused sigh and shook my head, turning my attention back onto my phone. However, just as my eyes dropped down to the tiny screen, I realized I had briefly spotted something out of place. Have you ever spotted something unusual or something that doesn't quite register correctly in your mind? Well, it was like that. I snapped my eyes back up to confirm what I had spotted. My wife's reflection in the mirror appeared to have emerald green eyes, not blue, staring back at her. I shut my own eyes tightly, wondering if my phone had perhaps strained my vision somehow. I opened them again and I brought it to my wife's attention, but she just laughed it off. She told me that it was probably the natural lighting coming through the stained glass window above the door, and that it was tinting her reflection. I considered the possibility, and before I could press further, she turned to me asking how she looked. Her dazzling blue eyes stared at me expectantly. Caught off guard by the sudden question, I dismissed the bizarre situation entirely. I complimented her appearance and we headed out for the evening. Over the next few weeks, we'd share many moments of her stopping to fix a stray hair or apply new lipstick in the walkway mirror, only for me to notice the stark difference in the color of her reflection's eyes yet again. I would also find myself desperately sneaking glances in the mirror of my own eyes when she wasn't around, only to find that my eyes were always the exact same shade of brown they had always been. I had trouble shaking the feeling, but life goes on, and we otherwise settled into the new place seamlessly. Then, one Friday morning, I had woken up alone in our bed. This was odd because I was usually the first one to get up in the morning. I called out to Leah asking where she was and what she was doing. After hearing no response, I got out of bed and wandered throughout the large house. It didn't take me long to realize that I was in fact alone. I was about to call Leah's phone, but before I pushed send, I realized my ignorance. Leah's father had gotten ill recently, and she had been planning on heading to her parents' house a few hours away for a weekend to spend some time with them. It had completely slipped my mind, and I didn't want to get another earful about how forgetful I am. I spent pretty much the entire weekend cooped up in my home office, writing, editing, and submitting. I had somehow condensed an entire month's worth of work into 3 days. During that time, I had been able to lose myself so deeply in my writing that I hadn't even checked my phone or remembered to text Leah to confirm when she would be home. By the time Sunday rolled around, I was finally able to pull myself away from my computer. It was then that I realized I hadn't heard anything from Leah for the whole weekend. It was then that I began to check my phone in the hopes that Leah had either messaged me or left a voicemail. I had received no such notifications. I dialed her number to make sure everything was alright, but I was immediately sent to her voicemail. By this point, my concerns had slowly started to rise. It wasn't like Leah to turn her phone off completely, especially when traveling alone. I then decided to call up my father-in-law to see if she had left later than anticipated, hoping for a jovial anecdote about Leah's clumsiness, leading to a broken cell phone during her visit or something of that nature. Leah's father, Walter, sounded confused yet grateful for my sudden call upon answering. I asked him if Leah was on her way back home after the visit with him, which garnered a bewildered response. After a very brief pause, he asked me what I was talking about. He mentioned that he hadn't seen Leah all weekend, that she was supposed to come visit but never showed, and he just assumed that she had work or wasn't feeling well herself. His confusion quickly turned to worry when he asked me if I knew where she was. A chill shot down my spine at the thought of my wife being missing. If she hadn't gone to visit her father and she wasn't answering her cell phone, there was no telling where she might be or what might have happened to her. After I ended my phone call with Walter, I tried to collect my racing thoughts and panic before deciding what to do next. I assumed that I should probably notify the police as soon as possible, and began to mentally make notes of all the places she might have gone to. That's when suddenly, I was snapped from my panicked state by the sound of keys turning in the front door, and the door swinging open downstairs. My heart thudded in my chest, and I gasped with relief as I ran down the stairs to the familiar sound of her shoes on the entryway floor. She set her bag down on the floor next to the front door, and I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tightly against me. I asked her where she had been, and she mentioned that she had gone to see her father, that she had told me about this trip weeks ago. I paused, but not just because of the blatant lie she had just told me, but because she was staring at me with two piercing green eyes. She told me she was tired after her long trip and was going to head off to bed early. I couldn't find my voice to answer her. I just returned a stunned nod. Just before she ascended the steps to the bedroom, however, she stopped to check her appearance in front of the large mirror in the entryway. I felt ice flow through my veins as I saw that her reflection now has bright blue eyes instead of green. I wasn't thrilled when my father initially offered me the job. Working with my family wasn't something I found appealing. Not to mention construction and demolition work never really piqued my interest either. I was more of a tech-savvy kind of guy, and working with my hands in a broad sense didn't really suit me. Not that there was anything wrong with doing that type of work, it was just how I felt personally. I had just started college and I was in desperate need of some form of income. Unfortunately, the town in which I lived had very little in the way of employment. Unless I wanted to be a cashier at a local supermarket, there wasn't very many opportunities. Much to my chagrin, I took my father up on his job offer. My dad had started his own independent construction and demolition company some years ago. With only a handful of employees, he managed to grow this small company into a somewhat lucrative business. After sitting down and speaking with him in detail about the job, I realized it actually didn't sound all that bad. He explained that he mostly needed clerical work done. He needed an extra pair of hands to process paperwork and do some inspections on potential jobs. Ultimately, he'd send me out to these locations, examine the building's exterior and interior, write down a list of things and bring it back. Then, after reviewing everything, we'd send the whole crew out to begin deconstruction. Well, about a week ago, we had received a demolition request to remove a building on the edge of town. When I first saw what the building was, I was instantly snapped back to my youth. The building was for an old Chuck E. Cheese's. For those of you unaware of what that is, it was basically a dining experience aimed towards children. They served pizza, snacks, your basic junk food items, had a truckload of various games with multiple prizes to be won. It was where a lot of kids would spend their birthday parties growing up. I should know, I was one of them. I thought back to the many years of birthday parties I had attended when I was younger. How my friends and I would run around gorging ourselves on slice after slice of pizza, while we mindlessly dropped tokens into the plethora of games, hoping to accrue just enough tickets to win the top prizes on the walls. The building itself was located quite a distance from the center of town. It was constructed in a small strip mall that was surrounded by trees and creeks. As I grew older, I rarely traveled that far out of town for anything. On the small random occasion, I'd see that one store after another would be closed and looking for new leases. It wasn't long until the pizza chain was the last one remaining. I'm not entirely sure the logistics behind it, but I think they were cutting funding to some of the stores and this one wasn't pulling enough business to endure. After my initial wave of nostalgia passed, I felt almost melancholic over the request. A piece of my childhood was ultimately going to be destroyed, and I was going to have a hand in it. My father, not being one to pass up on a work-related opportunity, was quick in dispatching me to the building. My tasks involved me surveying the nearby area for can or dumpster placements, examining the exterior for what type of equipment would be best suited, which I always suggested our largest excavator anyway, as well as inspecting the interior for any potential problems lying in wait. Most of the time, it was just squatters. You don't want to start tearing into a building and potentially injure or kill someone. I figured it wouldn't take too long to inspect the site, so I continuously pushed it off until the absolute last second. It was around 6 p.m. when I finished up a stack of paperwork and hopped in my car. The drive out to the building was a somewhat long one. Between the distance and traffic, I didn't arrive until well after 7. Luckily, since it was summer, the sun was still holding steady overhead. I pulled into the parking lot and noticed the unkempt lot itself. It was full of overgrowth from the surrounding nature, with weeds creeping up through various cracks in the cement. I parked in front of the building and stepped outside. Looking up at the worn sign, it was reaffirmed in my mind that this place, which probably filled children with fond memories, was now dead. I walked around the exterior, marking a few things on my clipboard as I went. I stepped around the left side of the building and saw a slew of mud and dirt that had probably been formed by bad weather. Everything was going well for the inspection. As I mentioned before, I only really do this as a courtesy. I stepped up to the front door, which still had a faded poster advertising games, pizza, and more, with a cartoonish Chuck E. Cheese giving a thumbs up. I pulled open the door, and an almost gasp-like sound greeted me. It was like the building had taken its first breath in a long time. It smelled like that too on the inside. The scent of stale air and mildew filled my nostrils, but I continued. I pulled out a flashlight I keep handy for jobs like this and ventured inside. For the most part, the whole interior had been gutted. Anything worth of value had long since been removed. All of the game cabinets, prize racks, and kitchen equipment had all been taken. All that was left was a faded carpet and a few decorations here and there. I scanned around with my flashlight, making notes as I went. It was clearly shaping up to be your average building demolition job. As I was walking into the main dining area, I heard a noise. It sounded like something small and metallic, clang softly off the ground. I turned to face the direction of the sound, only to be greeted by a large wall of cloth. I was facing the main stage, where the animatronic musicians would come out and perform intermittently. I called out, asking if anyone was there. I thought perhaps a squatter had made this building his temporary residence. I identified myself loudly and clearly, that I was with a construction company and that this building was scheduled for demolition. I figured even a squatter probably wouldn't want to be in a demoed building, much less have the authorities contacted to have them removed. There was no response. I sighed. I made my way around the waist-high stage to the stairs and ascended them. I grabbed a hold of the large curtain and ventured backstage. I was surprised to find this stage was much larger than what I had remembered. I recalled just a few inches of clearance between the band and the edge of the stage. However, this one seemed to push inward for a few feet. The moment I crossed into this area, I noticed a distinct drop in temperature. The warmth from the summer heat outside had been nearly extinguished. I rubbed my arms briefly as I stepped further inward. After taking a few steps, I immediately collided with something hard. I stumbled back a few steps, rubbing my face. Wondering what I had hit, I shined my light ahead of me. Two lifeless glass eyes reflected back at me. Startled, I took a few more steps back. A moment passed before I realized that it was one of the animatronic band members. The dog, to be specific. Their names had all been lost on me. It sat in place, staring at me with a blank expression, gripping a guitar in its hands. I turned and shined my light and spotted all of the other band members as well. The drummer, the keyboardist, and the hen were all aligned in a neat row. I thought it was odd that Chuck E. Cheese himself wasn't a part of the ensemble. I called out again, asking if anyone was staying on the stage, and that they should probably vacate the premises. But again, I received no response. Then, I heard that same metallic chime. But this time it happened behind me, back out onto the open dining room floor. I peeled the curtain back and saw the silhouette of a large figure standing dead center in the empty room. The whole room was dark, but I could tell right away that something was standing there. I aimed my light at it and saw that it was the Chuck E. Cheese animatronic. It was as if it had been standing there this whole time, but clearly it hadn't, or else I would have walked past it upon entering the room. I climbed down off stage and jotted down another note onto my clipboard. When I looked back up, Chuck E. Cheese had moved. He was slightly closer to me and offset by a few inches. I jumped back and asked if anyone was there. I told them that I would be notifying the authorities for trespassers and that they should leave immediately. It was a bluff, but I didn't know what else to do. I rationalized that the environment and atmosphere had been getting to me, and that I should just leave with the notes I had. I took a deep breath and walked past the oversized mouse. As soon as I got within arm's reach, however, its large hand shot out from its side, grabbing a hold of my arm. I shrieked and tried to pull away, but its grip felt like a vice around my wrist. With a series of clicks and motors whirring, its head began to turn towards me. Its glass eyes looked at me, and unlike its bandmates on stage, these didn't appear lifeless. His mouth began to open, and a guttural grinding noise bellowed out. I yanked and tugged on my arm. I even resorted to kicking the robot's side. The pressure on my wrist was immense, but I kept trying to free it. I managed to wedge my hand under its fingers and pry it off of me. The second I was freed, I sprinted out of the building and jumped into my car. I drove home as quickly and as safely as possible. During the entire drive, I kept checking over my shoulder to make sure it wasn't following me. After what I had just witnessed, I wasn't leaving anything to chance. When I arrived home, I set my clipboard in my dad's office and immediately went to bed. I lied awake for hours trying desperately to understand what I had just witnessed, but I couldn't. Eventually, fatigue took me and I drifted off. I was awoken by my father asking me to get ready for work. He wanted me to accompany him to the site of the demolition. I almost declined, but I couldn't think of a good excuse on the spot. We drove to the site with the rest of the crew and did another final inspection of the place. It was much different with a large group of people this time around. The air wasn't so heavy, and I didn't feel so unnerved. My dad cracked jokes and reminisced about the good old days. He turned to me and noticed I wasn't reacting to any of his jokes. He asked me if I was alright, but I couldn't shake my attention from the empty stage in front of me. As the demolition was getting underway, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. As I leaned up against the wall, trying desperately to catch my breath, I glanced down at the dirt and mud along the side of the building. In the mud, I saw multiple sets of large, unnatural footprints, all heading off into the woods nearby.